Jamie, there is a next summit, NATO summit planned for July 2018. Any particular deliverables you're now focused on?
In the cyber area, we're looking at two things. Number one, the Cyber Defence Pledge, which is now in its second year. This is a planning process that allows us to look deep into the cyber preparations of allied nations and get a good sense of what their strengths are and what their vulnerabilities are, and therefore what could be the risks to NATO's defence. So at the summit, the first thing that we'll have is a good report on the progress of the Cyber Defence Pledge, and that will allow us to redouble national efforts to improve protection of critical infrastructure, to improve their training, to improve their skills, to better direct their investments also into ensuring adequate military cyber defence too. That's the first thing. Second thing, cyber as a domain. As you know, all militaries now have to operate on the assumption that future conflicts will be operated in cyberspace, just as much as on land or sea and in the air. And at NATO, we're preparing ourselves to cope with that environment. And I think at the summit, we won't have completed all of the work, but we'll be telling our heads of state that we are much better prepared for the cyber dimension of conflict than we were just 2 or 3 years ago.
From the cyber warfare perspective, it's getting more and more interesting in the sense that some statistics say only 3 out of 10 cyber attacks, successful cyber attacks, are actually detected. Most of them go silent, unnoticed, and still very, very powerful, very effective, unlike traditional warfare where you get a lot of publicity around it before it even starts. Would you say, because it's fair to say, I guess, that we still live in the age of hacker paradise. Is it a fair statement, or things are changing for the better?
Well, you remember that old Beatles song, it's getting better all the time, and I mean this for the defence,
on the bright side, right?
And not just for the attackers. I mean, we are conscious of this, of course, cyber by stealth, and what we are doing in NATO is vastly improving our intelligence gathering. We've set up a new intelligence division since last year. This has now got dedicated cyber panels. It's got a cell on hybrid warfare to fuse intelligence. We've got industry partnerships now with 15 major companies. And during the recent WannaCry incident, we were able very quickly with industry to be able to analyze the malware and to immediately warn networks across the NATO enterprise to look out for WannaCry and what kind of preventative measures to take. So yes, I mean, it's work in progress, but in terms of early detection of cyber attacks, we're getting better all the time. We're also working on smart defense projects which will enable us better to check our systems, even in so-called normal times, to be more alert for any kind of bugs or Trojans or whatever that could have been implanted. So this detection issue is a real one, but we are not going to have situations any longer where, for example, computers are infected for 2 years before we know about it.
Jamie, from a layman's perspective, hackers operate like startups compared to big multinational corporations which tend to take weeks and months to process something. Similarly, one could say that if you think of a hacker, that's someone who has the flexibility, the luxury of flexibility, resilience, and can act promptly on whatever the person decides on. Likewise, is this the trend now? How do you do it from the NATO perspective? NATO is a huge machinery. How do you make it flexible and resilient?
Well, I think, first of all, you are right that sometimes big international organisations like behemoths may be slow in recognising a new threat, mainly, of course, because we like peace and don't like to have to think of threats or war. But when we recognise, like cyber, that this is a real threat and challenge, we actually mobilise very, very, very quickly. I mean, if you look at the NATO Cyber Defence policy just 3 or 4 years ago and compare with what we have today, where we've recognised cyber as a possible Article 5 act of collective defence, where we have the pledge, I just mentioned that, where we have cyber as a domain, where we have these memorandum of understanding with all of the allies on intelligence sharing and crisis management, where we have cyber attacks as a major part of our exercises, both at the political level, the military level, where we have the industry partnerships, and so on and so on and so on. We really have had a Copernican revolution on cyber in the last few years. So don't underestimate NATO's ability, once it sees the issue, to really ramp up activity very quickly indeed. That's exactly what we're doing.
Looking at things from the perspective of this conference, it's the 6th edition of CyberSec, the first one in Brussels, at the Europe's capital of policy making, you could say. Is it fair to say, Jamie, that concepts such as trust, cooperation, less and less silo are still largely theoretical concepts? And why is it so difficult to put in practice all those abstract sounding terms?
Well, again, it's a work in progress, but I think we're making progress indeed. For example, the European Union is here today at this conference, and yesterday we had a member of the European Parliament, Marietje Schaake, who's here, briefing our Cyber Defence Committee on what's going on in her area. We now have 4 specific cooperation initiatives with the European Union. The EU CERT is linked up to the NATO NCERC, and for example on WannaCry or NotPetya, these recent attacks, we've been exchanging a lot of information. We have a NATO Cyber Industry Partnership. I mentioned the 15 industry specific agreements that we have indeed, and indeed we're networked with Ukraine, with Georgia, with Sweden, with Finland, a large number of countries as well. We have more and more partners also at Tallinn at our NATO Centre of Excellence on Cyber Defence. So when it comes to breaking down those silos and getting people to share information and work together, again, compare the situation where we were 2 or 3 years ago with what we have today. Again, there's been a Copernican revolution. Of course, you can't rest on your laurels, and you have to make sure that the sharing is on a bilateral, I give and you give to me a basis to keep the partners incentivized. But everybody realizes that cyber is a team sport more than any other aspect of defense, and you're only as good as your ability to leverage the contribution of partners.
Jamie, I really couldn't be more optimistic listening to you in the morning as the first interviewee of the day. But let me ask you this last question, and perhaps the toughest one. At a conference like this, where policymakers meet, industry experts, representatives of the military, state, intelligence agencies, if you were to think of a single deliverable from a conference like that in its 6th edition, the first one in Brussels, what would it be? In other words, what would you like a conference like that to deliver for your very purposes?
Well, I think you said one thing, and I'm really sorry, but I'm going to say 2 things, so please forgive me. I think the first thing is that industry often is better than we are at identifying what's coming up, what's just around the corner, new technologies, new threat landscape, the new things that hackers are doing, and that we have got to look out for so that we can be less reactive and more preventive. The second thing is norms. Cyberspace, compared with the other areas of defence, lacks a kind of tradition of international law, international agreements, well understood concepts of self-defense, for example, of what is allowed, is not allowed. Industry, as you've seen recently with Microsoft, with its global Geneva Convention proposals. Industry is now getting into the game of coming up with ideas, but you need governments, not industry, to make treaties and to sign formal international agreements. So I'm also interested in how we can take the NATO industry dialogue forward so that we can identify on both sides those norms that are most realistic and which serve our interests both. So technologies and norms.